Happy Thursday, everybody. My name is Steve, and welcome to Rank the World, the podcast where a young white guy shares what he thinks about a variety of topics in a tier list format, because that's exactly what the world needed more of. Now, for those of you listening for the first time, this is what I like to call a homemade podcast, meaning I'm not recording in a full studio. I do use a nice XLR microphone with an audio interface, but that's just about where the list of professional equipment ends. I'll do my best to minimize background noise, but, if the dogs start screaming their heads off, if a car falls down, or the neighbors start jumping up and down while I'm in the middle of talking, I'm not going to start the whole thing over. Sound like a deal? Okay. One last thing before we begin, if you enjoy this podcast and want to see more of what I make, go check out my Linktree at linktree/derherrsturm. That's LINTR.ee/DERHERRSTURM. That's got links to my Twitch, YouTube, SoundCloud, and Twitter, where you can stay up to date with what I'm doing and when I'm doing it. Definitely not the same sort of content as you can listen to here, but who knows? You may find a thing or two worth enjoying. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started with today's topic. Seeing as we're approaching on the anniversary of the release of the Pokemon series, I found it fitting to talk about the mainline games, see how they stack up against one another. Same tier list rules as before. Standard tier list going from S to F tier, S being the best, F being the worst. And kicking things off, we have the games that started it all, Pokemon Red and Blue. These games, quite frankly, have aged horribly. A lot of the designs of the actual creatures themselves were so grotesque they ended up being changed, even inside the first generation that these games were in. There is no special defense stats, so both special attack and special defense were all lumped into one thing. Psychic type, as just a type as a whole, was extremely broken. Only had one weakness, being the bug type, and that type had 2 offensive moves. Both of them were really bad. Not even to mention, the vast majority of bug types were also weak to psychic, thanks to a secondary poison typing. At the same time, though, a lot of the flaws in this game give it a weird sense of charm. The setting in which these games take place, the Kanto region, to its credit, it pioneered the formula of world building in Pokemon games, but at the same time, it's not really special in any regard other than the fact that it was the first one. Not really a whole lot of compelling characters, except for a small handful, I suppose, but even then, that's really grasping for straws. And in addition to that, the story is not super compelling either. It basically boils down to you are a young child and you have to go out into the world and you have to learn about Pokemon, you have to find an adventure for yourself. Oh, there's this Team Rocket, they're bad, they steal Pokemon and profit off them. Oh, you have to stop them. Oh, we have this series of gyms, you have to fight them all, and then you have to go to the league, and you have to become the champion of the entire region. Not really compelling on any of those grounds. So I think, unfortunately for all those reasons, we have to start the episode off by assigning Pokemon Red and Blue as F-tier games. Next up, we have Pokemon Yellow, the first of what the community regards as sister games. Now, pretty much what a sister game in the Pokemon series serves to do is that it takes elements from both of the different versions, like exclusive Pokemon you can find in one version but not the other, sometimes character differences, sometimes story differences, not a whole lot of those in terms of Pokemon Yellow. And then it also sprinkles in some new things. Like, for example, in Pokemon Yellow, they throw in a couple characters from the anime, Jesse and James from Team Rocket, as well as their Meowth. As well as, instead of how in Red and Blue you got to choose between 3 starter Pokemon, them being Squirtle, Charmander, and Bulbasaur, you just get a Pikachu that you can't evolve. And Pikachu as a Pokemon is not that good of one to use. So it's really saying, oh, if you want to use your starter Pokemon, good luck. Apart from that, it does help out a little bit of the flaws that Red and Blue had. Mainly the designs of a lot of the creatures in the game that you can catch. They were updated a little bit. This game was optimized a little better for the Game Boy Color than Red and Blue were. And all around, I can summarize Pokemon Yellow as being Red and Blue, but just a little bit better. However, I don't think those improvements are quite enough to get it out of F tier. So although it is better than Pokemon Red and Blue, it's not better enough to break out into D tier. So Pokemon Yellow will be our second F tier. Next we have Pokemon Gold and Silver, the second generation, the sequels in all but name. It's just not Pokemon Red 2 and Blue 2. The region in which these games take place, the Johto region, apart from a select few locations like Ecruteak City and maybe New Barktown, maybe Violet City too, the locations and areas that you can find in the Johto region don't feel all that interesting. And that sort of tonal problem is also present in a lot of the new Pokemon they introduced. Sure, a lot of them are cute, and it does feel fairly consistent with the design philosophy that the first region, Kanto, introduced in terms of the Pokemon design. But other than that, I can't say there's anything especially special about the Johto region. To its credit, not only are the designs of some of the legendary Pokemon and the starter Pokemon and the select few new Pokemon like Kingdra comes to mind, and Ampharos and Steelix, some of them are kind of cool, I suppose. And also, additionally, it crammed probably double the amount of gameplay that people got from Generation 1, Red and Blue and Yellow, by including the Kanto region as well. So pretty much how that worked is after you did the whole gym challenge in Johto, you got the 8 badges, you challenged the Elite Four and the champion, you then got to do all that over again in Kanto. Albeit Kanto still isn't that compelling of a part of the Pokemon world. Doesn't feel like it has a whole lot of personality other than, oh, it's Kanto. You remember this place, right? Remember Kanto? At the time, it was very impressive to have 2 whole regions in one game. I don't think that's something they've done since, and I'm not convinced that's something they're ever going to do again. In addition, a lot of the mechanical flaws of Generation 1 are still present here, although they are alleviated just a little bit more with the addition of the Dark and Steel types, especially the Dark type, immune to Psychic, and also super effective against Psychic, so throwing a little more of a bone to the rest of the cast by making the Psychic type not quite as overpowered. So I think for all those reasons, Pokemon Gold and Silver just barely squeak it into D tier. Next we have Pokemon Crystal, the second of these sister games that Game Freak released. Has a lot of the same quality of improvement jumps that were in Yellow compared to Red and Blue for Gold and Silver. Focuses a bit more on the legendary Pokemon Suicune in the game's story. Other than that, not a whole lot of mechanical changes. I believe this game introduced the first female protagonist in the entire series that the player can choose to play as. And other than that, maybe some small, balance adjustments. There's not a whole lot to be said about Pokemon Crystal. Again, like Pokemon Yellow, it is a marked improvement over Gold and Silver. But once again, I don't think it's quite enough to squeak it out of D tier. So that is where it will go. Next we have Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire for the Game Boy Advance. A really good graphical, mechanical, and narrative jump from the previous two generations. The Hoenn region, where these games take place, feel like they have a lot more personality and a lot more life pumped into them than Johto and Kanto. I believe that sort of life is really illustrated well by the new Pokemon that are introduced in this region. Legendaries look really good, the starters look really good. By and large, this is a really good addition to the Pokemon series as a whole. A little bit difficult by today's standards, but it's not egregiously so. The game engine as a whole feels pretty good, and the same can be said about the total gameplay experience. There are a few nitpicks I have about these games, like really inconsequential things like font sizes that get fixed with Pokemon Emerald. We'll be talking about that in just a bit here. But other than that, these are really solid entries. Not even to mention the music. That must be one of the most integral things about building Ruby and Sapphire's character is the music. Out of all the games in the series, I think Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald as well, all the Generation 3 games, feel the most distinct and recognizable just by their sound alone. So for those reasons, Ruby and Sapphire are a solid B-tier entry. Next we have Pokemon Emerald. Just almost the gold standard in terms of how a sister game in the Pokemon main series should be done. It incorporates not only the general quality of life improvements that were present in Crystal and Yellow by bringing version-exclusive creatures all into one package, but it also does the same thing for the narratives of both Ruby and Sapphire. Each game had their own evil team. Ruby had Magma, Team Magma, that wanted to expand the land with the legendary Pokemon Groudon, and Pokemon Sapphire had Team Aqua, that wanted to do the same thing but with the sea and the legendary Pokemon Kyogre. What Emerald really does is show how both of these teams interact with one another in a better way than either Ruby and Sapphire were able to do, as well as have both of them pose a threat to the region as a whole at the same time. There are some other changes as well. There's a different final gym leader, general balance changes, and a different champion. But other than that, really a step above Ruby and Sapphire. So I think because of all those reasons, Pokemon Emerald is an A-tier game. Next we have the first remakes in the Pokemon series, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. Pretty much an easy summary of these games is that they took the original Pokemon games Red and Blue. Well, in Japan it was Red and Green, hence the names Fire Red and Leaf Green. It pretty much took those games and put them in the same engine that Pokemon Emerald and Ruby and Sapphire were in. And in doing so, it solved a lot of the mechanical issues that were in Red and Blue. The Psychic type is not nearly as broken anymore. The special stat had been split into special attack and special defense, further nerfing Psychic types, as well as bringing in the new mechanics that Generation 3 had, like abilities, natures, effort value training, just stuff that really leveled the board from a mechanical standpoint. So for all those reasons, Fire Red and Leaf Green are B tier. Again, it still suffers from the narrative and world building issues that the first Red and Blue had. Those aren't really changed that much from the original games, but still very fun to play. Next we have Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon Pearl, the first entries for the Nintendo DS. Focusing on the good, the Sinnoh region does feel a lot different from every other region we had had before, and to a certain extent, every other region that we would experience since. Very solid roster of new Pokemon that were introduced. Unfortunately, a good deal of those Pokemon were not available in these games. Additionally, to its credit, the rest of the games beforehand had a problem where whether or not an attack used a Pokemon's attack stat or a special attack stat would be purely dependent on the type of the move. All fire type moves were special attacks, all rock type moves were physical attacks, so on and so forth. When really there was a lot of room for nuance within each type. You had moves like Fire Punch that for some reason were special attacks, even though they used like physical attack. And you had moves like Earth Power that weren't physical, but they still used the attack stat. Starting off with Diamond and Pearl, that issue was fixed. However, the battle engine in these games, they get fixed a little bit with future Generation 4 entries, but in Diamond and Pearl, it was really slow. That was primarily caused by how HP went down, how a Pokemon's health stat was reduced. It wasn't reduced by, like, if you one-shot a Pokemon, the entire health bar would go down within like a certain amount of time. That's not how it worked. It went down by a certain amount of points per time interval. So if you had a Pokemon with a really high HP stat and it got one-shot, it took forever for that health bar to go down. So I think for all those reasons, we are going to be having our first C entry. Our first entry into C tier for the day, with Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Next we have Pokemon Platinum, a game that, along with Pokemon Emerald, really hit it out of the park in terms of being a sister game. Whereas Pokemon Diamond and Pearl each focused on one specific legendary Pokemon, being Dialga and Palkia, Pokemon Platinum not only incorporated both of those two in the story to pose an even bigger threat, but it also involved a third legendary Pokemon, Giratina, that came in and did its own thing, took over the story for a little while, which allowed the introduction of an area called the Distortion World, which I think is the most interesting looking location that the Pokemon series has ever had. You had stuff like waterfalls falling up, islands that were floating horizontally, really weird sense of physics there that really bolstered what kind of creature Giratina was. It made that point in the story feel really serious in a way that not a whole lot of games before and since had been able to accomplish. In addition, it helped fix a lot of the problems that Diamond and Pearl had. The battle engine feels just a little bit faster, still just a little bit too slow for my tastes personally, but it does certainly help. It finally introduced a lot of the new Pokemon introduced in Generation 4 that were not able to be obtained in Diamond and Pearl. Pokemon like Electivire and Magmortar, new evolutions for older Pokemon that really had nice designs. And all in all, were a really big step forward in terms of the Pokemon game formula as a whole. So I think for those reasons, Pokemon Platinum will be our first S tier of the day. Next we have Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, our second batch of remakes for the day. Although it does incorporate a lot of the same quality of life improvements and good things in terms of gameplay that were present in Pokemon Platinum, it's still just the Johto region, plus the Kanto region for the post-game, but mostly the Johto region. It introduces a few new characters, Team Rocket members, and that's about it. But still at the same time, at least to me, the story isn't compelling, neither are the areas that are present. So I think for all those reasons, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, although these are widely regarded as some of the best games in the series, I'm going to be placing them in B tier. Next we have Pokemon Black and White. Admittedly, the Unova region is not the most compelling setting in the Pokemon world. It does have a decent range of diversity in terms of geography. It has some nice mountains, it has some nice forests, it has a nice little desert area. But where I think these games really shine are in terms of its story and in terms of its selection of new Pokemon. For whatever reason, a lot of people don't like a good selection of the new Pokemon, like the Trubbish line, the Vanillite line, Pokemon like that. I personally think they're kind of neat, because the situation with these games is they were a sort of soft reboot on the series. The only Pokemon you could catch in these games, at least before the post-game, were like brand new Unova Pokemon. So what they were really doing with this is they were completely redoing Generation 1, introducing just new Pokemon, throwing in similar archetypes, like you've got the electric type, you've got the poison type, you've got all those, but with completely new designs. And I think Game Freak did a good job in doing that. Now, as for the story, very rarely am I as engrossed in a game's story as I was with Pokemon Black and White. I think only 2 other times have I ever gotten to a point in a game's story where the story was so engaging and exciting that I just got to that point and I finished the game in that setting, just based on the tension and the pacing of the story alone. A lot of fans regard this as the best story in the series, and as of right now, I find it hard to disagree with them. So I think for all those reasons, Pokemon Black and White are also S-tier entries in the series. Next we have their direct sequels, Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2. Premise of these games, it's 2 years after Pokemon Black and White. The Unova region has changed a little bit since we last saw it. The evil team from Black and White, Team Plasma, had been disbanded, but now a selection of that team has been operating in the shadows and is now back to try to take over the region and the world again. This time, not playing like not a morally gray, but like a conflicted stance, like a sympathetic stance like they did in Pokemon Black and White, because the whole deal in Black and White was, oh, we need to free Pokemon so that they can live their lives as they so choose, rather than be subjected to the wills of humanity, while the conflict also being, oh, Pokemon and humanity rely and depend on each other and they help one another. It's not like a parasitic relationship, it's a symbiotic one. Whereas in Black 2 and White 2, Team Plasma really gets to play into the whole, oh, we're evil and we know it and we're not sorry about it. While still having all of the new Pokemon that were introduced in Black and White, we also get some old favorites from previous generations. And we get some like slight tweaks to the battle engine that just make it even more enjoyable to play. So I think although it doesn't quite have the narrative pull that Black and White had, in terms of mechanics alone, it is one of the best in this series. So I think for those reasons, it just barely squeaks it in to S tier as well. Next we have Pokemon X and Y, the first 3D entries into the series. The story is not as compelling as I think it should be, because the main antagonist team of this game, Team Flare, their leader's whole thing is, oh, if nothing changes, the beauty in this world is going to die out, and his solution to that is, I'm going to wipe humanity off the face of the earth, and unfortunately, as a consequence to that, all Pokemon are going to be erased as well. That is a very heavy topic, and this game does not treat it as heavy of a topic as it is. I think if this game treated its themes in the same way that Black and White did, this could have been one of the best stories in the series. Unfortunately, that is not the world we live in. Instead, we get a world where the game is incredibly easy. The new mechanic that it introduces, Mega Evolution, although quite broken in some regards, is still a really fun mechanic, and it's one of the fan favorites, mine included. Personally, it's my favorite mechanic they've introduced in the series ever. And really a lackluster story. The smallest pool of new Pokemon I think we've ever gotten. And a good number of those Pokemon aren't super compelling either. There are some gems, like the 3 starters. You've got Dragalge is pretty cool. You've got Goodra. You've got Aegislash. Other than that, it's just meh across the board. So I think for all those reasons, Pokemon X and Y are D tier entries. Next, we have the remakes for Generation 6, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Quite honestly, these games are the best remakes we have ever gotten. They bring the best of the quality of life improvements that were present in Generation 6 and place them in the Hoenn region. It iterates very nicely on a lot of the themes and the world building that the Hoenn region had in Ruby and Sapphire, and even Emerald too. They invented an entire post-game story that centered around stuff that happened in Pokemon Emerald, and like new stuff entirely as well, titled the Delta episode. It added a bunch of new Mega Evolutions. It added new forms for Groudon and Kyogre, ancient primal forms that were really some of the most broken things to be introduced in a Pokemon game, but that's neither here nor there. Although it didn't bring back the Battle Frontier like it had been in Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald, it still had something not quite like it, but served a decently similar function, I suppose. But other than that, these were really solid games. One of my favorites, to be honest. And for all those reasons, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are A-tier entries in the series. Now, right here is where I would talk about what the Gen 6 sister game was, or sequel game was. But we didn't get those. Instead, we got the debut entries in Generation 7, Pokemon Sun and Moon. These games take place in the Alola region, a new sort of setting composed of 4 islands that is inspired heavily by Hawaii. And I think it takes that premise of being based on Hawaii and incorporates it really well in the game's setting, the new Pokemon that are introduced. Not quite necessarily the narrative, but you get the idea. It makes some decent quality of life changes in terms of improvement over Generation 6. It's a lot more fun of a game to play than X and Y were. However, the opening of this game is very boring. And what I mean by that is that it holds the player's hand a lot. The majority of the first 2 hours at least of the game are borderline pure tutorials, and there's no real way to skip them. And in addition to that, they didn't completely remove Mega Evolution, but it's not present at all in the game's story, not until the post-game. They didn't introduce any new forms, and instead they introduced a mechanic called Z-moves, which were a little crystal you could give your Pokemon to hold. It would really boost the power of one of their moves, and you could use it once per battle. It was pretty much a cutscene that did a lot of damage. Some of them were kind of cool, I suppose. Mimikyu, a new Pokemon in Sun and Moon, ended up getting a cool one, but not until later in the generation. The starters each got their own specialized Z-move. Each of them looked really cool. And it also introduced some themes of outer space and alternate dimensions with Pokemon like the Ultra Beasts that are really the most unorthodox designs we've ever had in the entire series, and also the boxed legendaries of these games, Solgaleo and Lunala. All those were pretty cool, I suppose, but I don't know, I can't justify putting these games any higher than C tier. Now, Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. I would call this kind of game a sort of hybrid between the sister games of the first 4 generations and the sequels that were in Generation 5. It adds a little bit onto the story. It enhances the story a little bit like the sister games had, while like Black 2 and White 2, it incorporated the third legendary of the game in a much more fused way. In Black 2 and White 2, the third legendary, Kyurem, is the main center of the story and gets fused with the legendaries of Black and White, Reshiram, and Zekrom. A very similar thing happens here with the third legendary for Generation 7, Necrozma, and then Solgaleo and Lunala. They get fused with each other. The way in which they incorporate this mechanic is just a little bit less interesting here than it was in Black 2 and White 2. It still suffers from a lot of problems that Sun and Moon had, like with how much it holds the player's hand through the first several hours of the game. Still no Mega Evolutions, although it introduces a few new cool Z moves that weren't present in Sun and Moon. And all in all, if you had played through Sun and Moon, there honestly wasn't a whole lot different about these games until near the end of the story. To its credit, it did introduce a really cool post-game story with like a parallel world version of Team Rocket called Rainbow Rocket, and Giovanni from Red and Blue teams up with every other evil team leader from all the games past. All in all, it was a decently fun experience. And I think for all those reasons, it barely scrapes it into B tier. I think the improvements that it introduced were just enough to put it that much apart from Sun and Moon. Next we have Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, 2 remakes of Pokemon Yellow. Now what set these games apart from every other game we're going to talk about today is that it replaced the catching mechanic that players could use to catch new Pokemon. It instead utilized the mechanics that were present in Pokemon Go, hence the names Pokemon Let's Go. A lot of people didn't like this change. I didn't mind it. I thought it was a really interesting way to try to tap in to that new player base that Pokemon Go introduced. And overall, I don't think it detracted that much from the overall gameplay experience. The graphics and art style of this game, I personally think are this game's strongest point. This is the nicest the Kanto region has ever looked. And it still introduced some nice quality of life improvements, both from Generation 6 and 7. It didn't introduce, but it utilized Mega Evolutions for the Pokemon that were in Yellow that had them. And other than that, good, solid fun. So I think for those reasons, I think Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee fall into C tier. Next we have Pokemon Sword and Shield, the first true mainline entries on the Switch. These games suffer from a good deal of, well, not a good deal, a decent amount of performance issues. The graphics are not this game's strongest point. The mechanics are pretty good. Much like Generation 7 before it, it scrapped the previous generation's new mechanic and created a new one called Dynamaxing, where in certain areas when battling, you could supersize your Pokemon. You can make them giant. Pretty much what this mechanic served to do is it borrowed elements from both Z moves and Mega Evolutions. Some Dynamax Pokemon also changed their appearance, them being called Gigantamaxing. And when a Pokemon Dynamaxes or Gigantamaxes, all its moves get changed to like much more powerful standard moves for each type. Save for a few exceptions, they were the same moves no matter what Pokemon you used. And I think out of those 3 new mechanics that were introduced, I think Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing are probably the most balanced. In terms of setting, the Galar region, it has a little bit of personality to it, but it is extremely linear. The most linear I think any Pokemon game has ever felt, and I think that's to its detriment. it does try to do some interesting things in terms of character development, primarily for the rival character Hop. Because for a majority of the Pokemon games, all the fame and the fortune falls upon the player character, and the rivals' characters, even though they have their own ambitions, usually fall by the wayside. This game's narrative tries to deal with that fact with the character of Hop. His brother, his big brother, is the undefeated champion of the Galar Pokemon League, and as such, he wants to have a sort of legacy like that. What he really wants to do, he wants to become the next Leon, his older brother. But as the story goes on, it becomes more and more apparent that that is just not going to happen. And at some points, it gets really sad to see Hop simply unable to achieve his dream. But instead of just falling by the wayside completely, he instead shifts his goals to something else completely. Instead of being the next champion, he ends up beginning training to become the next Pokemon professor. I think it's a really interesting character arc that they do for this character specifically, and it's something I don't think they'll ever quite do again, which I think is a real shame. So I think all things being said, and additionally, a lot of the Pokemon that are introduced don't have super compelling designs. There are a few diamonds in the rough. Obstagoon is a really cool regional evolution for a regional variant of Linoon. You have Surfetched, an evolution for a regional variant of Farfetch'd. Additionally, this game has some of the worst post-game content I've ever seen. It is saved a little bit with the DLC, but that's an additional $30, $60 you have to pay for a complete game. So I think, unfortunately, with all things being said, although there are some things worth note in terms of improving the series as a whole, I can't in good conscience put Pokemon Sword and Shield any higher than C tier. Next we have Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the safest entries in the Pokemon series. Unlike remakes like Fire Red and Leaf Green or Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and especially Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, these remakes do almost nothing in terms of changing up what the original Diamond and Pearl had laid out to do. Sure, it puts on a new graphical coat of paint, and sure, it remasters a lot of the soundtrack, but other than that, these are borderline carbon copies of the original games. There are a small select quality of life improvements that were brought in generations since, but those are far outweighed by the bugs and performance issues that are in this game. There's a whole lot of model clipping. It's clear this game was not optimized as well as it could have. So I think although in terms of mechanics they are just a bit better than the original Diamond and Pearl, I don't know. It wouldn't feel right to me to put them any higher than D tier. Next we have one of the most interesting games in the entire series, Pokemon Legends Arceus. Now what this game does is it takes place in a truly ancient part of the Pokemon world, like hundreds, possibly thousands of years before any of the other games in the series, an ancient form of Sinnoh that is called the Hisui region. Now because of that setting comes in a lot of changes in terms of the Pokemon that are available, as well as how the game works. Instead of it feeling like it's a whimsical adventure you as a young person are taking as a coming-of-age story, woohoo, it feels more like there is a lot of stuff we don't know about this world. It is very dangerous. It is your job to document it. Try not to die out there. It really makes the Pokemon world as a whole feel more realistic than it ever has, and have a lot more weight to what's going on. There are feuds between groups in this land. There are unknown phenomena that you have to discover and solve. And in terms of the catching mechanic specifically, it is the most immersive game that we have probably ever seen. The art style feels really stylized. What it feels like is this is Game Freak's attempt at making Pokemon Breath of the Wild. And while it is certainly no Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, I think it is one of the best games that tries to accomplish what Breath of the Wild did that we have seen yet. So I think for all those reasons, Pokemon Legends Arceus is an S-tier entry in the series. Now finally we have the most recent mainline entries in the series, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Much like Black and White, this game's story is one of the most compelling and interesting we have ever seen. It focuses a lot more in terms of character development for a greater number of characters than Sword and Shield did, and I think on those fronts, it does a lot better job than Sword and Shield did. Mechanics-wise, this is my favorite in the series. It's a lot of fun to play. Never before have I had more fun filling out a Pokédex than I have had in these games. It really encourages exploring the region that, other than Legends Arceus, I don't think any game before has done. And additionally, like Black and White, its story was so engaging that once I hit a certain point, I became so engaged by that story that I finished the game right from when that point started, all in one sitting. The only other game that comes to mind that has gotten me that engaged is Portal 2, but that's neither here nor there. Unfortunately, this game suffers from the most performance issues we have ever seen, probably in a Switch game ever. There is a lot of stuttering, there is a lot of clipping through objects, there is a lot of the camera showing through a lot of the scenery. To be honest, if it weren't for these performance issues, this would also be an S-tier entry in the series. However, taking those into account, although the mechanics are really good and the story is really good, the performance issues are so bad, I can't in good conscience put these games any higher than B tier. And with that being said, we have finished today's rankings. In F tier, we have Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Red and Blue. In D tier, we have Crystal, Gold and Silver, X and Y, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. In C tier, we have Diamond and Pearl, Sun and Moon, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, and Sword and Shield. In B tier, we have Ruby and Sapphire, Fire Red and Leaf Green, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and Scarlet and Violet. In A tier, we have Emerald, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire. And in S tier, we have Platinum, Black and White, Black 2 and White 2, and Pokemon Legends Arceus. And that's about it for this episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed, feel free to follow the podcast on your platform of choice, including Spotify, YouTube, Pocket Casts, and Anchor. I'll be back next week with another new topic, but until then, you all have yourselves a damn good one.